I'm really looking forward to today's meeting. We have Robin from SDSU here, and she's going to talk about pollinators in the cut flower garden. And I think it's an interesting topic at any scale. It's something that you can implement little pieces of into your cut flower garden to make it a better habitat for pollinators. And when Robin and I were discussing this topic, we were even talking about how it can be used when you're chatting with customers. And so I found that really interesting, and it was an angle that I hadn't thought about before. So I'm excited for Robin to share more. And so I'll turn it over to you, Robin, and we'll hopefully have a little bit more discussion at the end.
Sure. Yeah, for sure. I will share my screen. Thank you, Morgan. So many of you know already that I talk a lot about native plants, and so it's really fun to talk about native plants and pollinators. I'm not an entomologist per se, but I think working with native plants, you just get, it's a natural association to be interested in the insects and the pollinators that you can find in those different native plant habitats. So today I'm going to talk about native plants and pollinator habitat certification, as Morgan mentioned, as kind of potentially a way that you can increase interest and also use it as something for marketing as well. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about what the problem is. You know, we're seeing lots of declines in pollinators. And then specifically, as is my background in native plants, how native plants especially can be a way to help support our pollinators. And then get into talking about creating pollinator habitat on your cut flower farm, show just a few fun examples, and then go over a couple of resources. And so, yeah, depending on, hopefully I can get through it pretty quick, and then we can actually have more time for discussion. Christine, I see, is joining us, and she already knows a lot about cut flowers and pollinators. So, you know, we could have definitely a great discussion too. So, you know, many of you might be aware, but we have a lot of biodiversity loss right now due to land conversion. You know, we have agriculture here more in a rural state, but even in our areas that are more urban, like Sioux Falls and Brookings, I mean, it's pretty common to see kind of that urban sprawl, those suburbs or housing developments on the outskirts of even our smaller towns. So we're really seeing a lot of habitat loss for not just pollinators, but plants, for other animals, for insects of all types. And as we are seeing more of this urban development, we have a lot of lawn. It's kind of a monoculture space that actually is also using a lot of inputs, you know, chemicals for fertilizer, for pesticides, and even for water. And so a lot of this land conversion is really causing a negative effect on our pollinators. And so you might think, well, I'm growing cut flowers. I'm already helping with our pollinators. You know, obviously cut flowers, you're cutting a lot of them, but there's plenty of flowers to be sharing for all of our other like insects and birds and pollinators. But as there are many types of flowers, there are many types of pollinators as well. And so, you know, some of the cut flowers that we might be growing, while they're gorgeous and we love them, might not always be as appropriately suited for our native pollinators, especially. So things like bees, you know, everybody's familiar with honeybees and some of the problems that are occurring with those, but we actually have almost 4,000 native bees in North America, and those often may have more specialized relationships with specific types of plants. And also, you know, there's a lot more out there for pollinators than just bees, you know, butterflies, of course. At night, we're seeing more moths. Beetles are pollinators, ants, flies. You might not necessarily want flies on in your property as a pollinator, but then things like bats and even birds are also great pollinators. But as I mentioned, due to habitat loss, there's about 40% of our pollinator species are at risk of extinction. This is a study done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, came up with that number. And then there's other research that is showing that, you know, not just pollinators, but insects worldwide, we're seeing the #1 drivers of those are that habitat loss and then also pollution, like the different pesticides, as I mentioned. Here's an example of what that looks like in North America here. And so if you're thinking about what pollinators need, they need food, shelter, water, and then they need those specific host plants in which to raise their young. And when we're seeing a lot of development, and then of course here, this is kind of highlighting our, corn belt or our agriculture belt as showing some of the most losses. We really need to think about what we can do in our own properties to help support some of these pollinators. And that second driver of insect loss and pollinators was pesticide and chemical use. And you can see kind of follows about the same type of a map showing right here in our agricultural areas in North America that we do have a lot of pesticide use as well. This is just one example of chlorpyrifos insecticide. But if you want to see more, maybe you don't want to see more about this because it can be kind of depressing, but there is a website where you can look up all the different types of pesticides that are used, and you can see how they have changed over time. So some of those pesticides, of course, are not being used as much, but often is the case is that if one is not used anymore, then it's replaced by another one. And we don't necessarily always know what the long-term effects of those are going to be. So away from the depressing stuff, how can we help? And so, of course, native plants are one way that we can really help to support our ecosystems, our pollinators, our insects, our birds, all of those different things. And so native plants are those that have developed in a region or an ecosystem over hundreds or thousands of years without introduction by humans. So think about what the prairie looked like, hundreds or even thousands of years ago, and how those insects have developed alongside of those plants. So these native plants really are supporting our insects, our birds, and our wildlife, supporting all of that biodiversity. But there's also some other benefits to those native plants as well. Native plants help to improve our soil and our water quality, especially when compared to some of the non-natives that we might be familiar with, including our lawn grass. But even some of those non-native flowers don't have as extensive of root systems. And there's actually kind of a, a misconception that those root systems are actually there to provide drought tolerance, which is a little bit in dispute right now, but what the root systems really do is go deep into the soil, provide a habitat for the soil microorganisms that live in our area. Those microorganisms help to cycle carbon and nutrients. And then in the fall, as those plants die back, their root systems die back a little bit too, and that provides a lot of organic material into our soil. And that's one of the reasons why we're called, the breadbasket of America, or, why we have such rich soils here for farming is because those native plants with their deep roots have really contributed greatly to our rich soils here. And of course, they also help to prevent erosion and help infiltrate water. So there are a lot of great benefits that native plants provide, not just to our pollinators. And often they don't require very much for maintenance and inputs once established. Now, I'm definitely not going to say that they don't need any maintenance, because anybody who's tried to grow a pollinator garden or native plants will definitely attest to the fact that, weeds are still an issue, but we'll kind of go into that a little bit as far as like site prep and how we can kind of do as much as possible to minimize those weeds and that maintenance kind of as we progress along our journey to creating a pollinator garden. And native plants also provide a lot of benefits to us, to human health and well-being, whether it's by helping to clean the water, provide fresh air, and just, provide that enjoyment and awe that you get when you see a garden that's just like thriving and buzzing with life. I know that there's a stark difference in some of the gardens that I've been to that are native plant gardens versus some that are just more ornamental. And you can just see that they're just, buzzing and crawling with all of these insects. And maybe that's making you afraid because you don't want all of these insects in your cut flowers. But I would say that for the most part, they're going to be more fun and beneficial than they are going to be harmful. And in fact, a lot of these, bringing in a lot of these native pollinators and insects might actually improve with some of the pests that you might be seeing. And so even small habitat patches with native plants are important. Of course, having connectivity between these patches is really the best solution. So not necessarily everybody transforming all of their yards to native plant habitat or all of your farms, but just creating these, pockets of sanctuary, but then making sure that we can hopefully ultimately, have enough of these that are connected so that it's providing corridors for our pollinators to move safely throughout the landscape. So I'm going to talk about what you can do to create pollinator habitat. And so I'm going to go into this with a little bit different avenue as far as, not necessarily having your cut flower, fields be the pollinator habitat. Of course, they can definitely help, but as a way to think about creating pollinator habitat on your farms or in your gardens, in addition to what you're doing for your cut flowers. And so just quickly to go over some of the basic things that are important for pollinator gardens. Of course, pollinators need food. When we're talking about habitat, they need food and shelter. And so those are the two things that I'll be touching on right here. So when you're thinking about food, you want plants that have a lot of pollen and nectar. So nectar is kind of like the sugar source, the energy source, and pollen is more of the protein. And often it's bees who are utilizing the pollen more, but the other pollinators are just kind of transferring pollen from one plant to another, which actually helps with the plants and their reproductive cycle. And then choosing host plants for butterflies and moths, of course, probably one of our number one host plants that everybody is familiar with are milkweeds for monarch butterflies, but there are actually lots and lots of different butterflies and specialist pollinators and insects that require specific native plants or plants in order to complete their life cycle. So you can go beyond just the milkweeds and monarchs in your gardens and think about other pollinators and their specific host plants as well. And then also planting a variety of flowers for season-long blooms and also different flower shapes, which I'll kind of touch on here in a minute as well. But just making sure that we have plants in our gardens that are blooming from early spring through summer all the way into fall. And of course, I mean, many of you who have cut flower businesses are already familiar with that because you also want cut flowers to be available throughout those whole seasons for the biggest revenue source. So it's kind of thinking about that in parallel. So you have your cut flowers that you want to use throughout the season, but we also have native plants and these pollinator gardens that pollinators can be using for their resources throughout the season as well. And then a little bit different as far as pollinator gardens compared to when I talk about other types of planting styles for native plants. For pollinator gardens, you really do want to plant flowers in groups. So I'm kind of a big fan of the naturalistic planting style for landscaping. So I really like to have that kind of natural prairie look where you have maybe drifts of plants and a lot of grasses. But really for pollinator gardens, you do want to have those flowers in groups just so that when a pollinator, a butterfly finds the plant that it needs for nectar, it doesn't have to fly too far to get to more of those nectar sources. It kind of, if it has something it prefers, it can just kind of stay in this little patch and then it's not using as much energy to try to get around to these different places. And then this one might be also a little bit more controversial with this group is to be okay with some plant damage. So example, to the left there is the leaf cutter bee and some ash leaves. So pollinator gardens are meant to be a resource. They are meant to be used. And so in some cases, like with the caterpillars who are munching down all of the milkweeds, it is important to be aware that there might be some plant damage, but maybe if you have your pollinator garden, kind of off to the periphery of your cut flower garden, it can actually draw some of those insects away that might prefer some of those plants as compared to the plants that you're going to be using for your flowers. And then also pollinators need different types of shelter. So, planting in layers, and you kind of want to do that in a garden design anyways. You want to have your different structural and kind of like seasonal layers and your ground cover layers. So just as in like good design, pollinators like to have plants in layers as well. And that really helps provide protection from weather, whether it's rain or wind or things like that. So they kind of have a place where they can take shelter. And maybe you've heard about leaving the stems of different plants for pollinators to overwinter in and, lay their eggs or different things like that. And so it is important to leave some dead branches or stems, especially the ones that are more hollow. about 6 to 12 inches is really all you need. And so if you cut those back, in early spring, or if you wanted to do that in the fall, then, your new plants are going to grow up above that height and usually kind of, minimize the appearance of those dead stems. And then you can kind of keep those even for several years. I was reading some research about pollinators and stem nesting pollinators. It said actually like that first year isn't always utilized as much as like years 2 and 3 for those stems. So, keeping those dead stems up for longer periods of time is helpful. And then also leaving leaves on the ground. There's another campaign you might have heard of is Leave the Leaves, just because a lot of pollinators overwinter in the leaves. And then also nesting sites in the ground. So some areas of soil uncovered is also important for those ground nesting bees. And then again, as with our, food sources, grouping planting so the pollinators can move safely among the plants that they're the most interested in is also really important. And so you don't have to do it all on your own. There are actually a lot of great resources out there for plant selection and design for different pollinator gardens. This example on the left here is from Grow Native. And so they have a whole list of different types of gardens, whether you want a hummingbird garden or, this one is a butterfly garden or, a garden for shade. And so it even gives you a plant list and even an example plant layout that can be really helpful if you're just kind of unsure of where to get started. One thing I will mention on the Grow Native website, they are out of Missouri. So we do have to kind of be aware of the difference in growing zone and ecoregion. And so I would just encourage people, if you are looking on some of these sites, always kind of cross-reference any plant lists that are recommended with, what will actually grow best here in South Dakota. And then another example is from the USDA. And this is an example of a dry pollinator garden. And it gives you also the plant list, the Latin name, how many plants to use, and some of that plant characteristic information. So these resources can be really helpful for getting started. And I would recommend kind of checking some of them out. Just wanted to go into a little bit of the different flower traits. Sometimes they're called flower syndromes for the different pollinators. Of course, having a variety of colors will attract various pollinators. A lot of times your butterflies are going to be interested in like the bright red and the purple plants. But for example, bees, they can't actually really see red. So for them, red just looks like a shadow. So they're more interested in yellow plants and other types of flower colors, which is kind of interesting. I mean, not that, you won't see bees on different red and purple flowers as well, but it's just kind of a matter of what they're more attuned to be able to see. Also, nectar guides. Nectar guides are really cool. They're a lot of times the different patterns that you'll see on flowers that we think are attractive are actually kind of an association and a relationship between the plants and their pollinators, kind of like a whole different language as far as like showing them where to go just to get right to the nectar or the pollen and kind of drawing them in. So nectar guides are kind of interesting. Odor, of course, we love flowers that smell great. And probably you don't want to attract filth flies to your garden with putrid odors, but that is something that also can be a pollinator as flies, but we won't go into that today. But yeah, the nectar, so nectar is available and present in a lot of different flowers, even when pollen isn't. So you want to have a combination of really great nectar plants and also plants that are going to produce pollen that, bees can utilize for raising their young. And then the shape of flowers is also kind of attractive to different types of pollinators. For example, bumblebees really like the tubular flowers that you can see in maybe like snapdragons or penstemon, those types of things. And so what I want to talk about before the actual planting is just that there are some really cool resources and certification processes that you can go to be able to just really help kind of boost your potential marketing for your farm. And so Pollinator Partnership is one example of a website that has a ton of resources. The website is pollinator.org. They have most of their focus is probably on native plants, but they do provide plant lists of things like herbs and some of the other non-native plants that are also in good resources for pollinators as well. You can register your garden or your farm and even get certified. They have classes available for like an online pollinator steward certification. They provide planting guides and resources, and then of course habitat signs. And sometimes the habitat signs are a lot of fun because having those signs around is a really good indication to the public and to, you know, people who might be visiting your farm that not only are you producing wonderful flowers, but you're also really being a good steward of the pollinators as well. So this graphic to the right is just an example of a pollinator card. That's kind of a quick reference on this website that shows different pollinator plants for different regions. This slide here shows what the backside of that card looks like. So it gives you a little bit of advice for planting. So how to identify your spot, how to prepare the site, how to plant your plants, and a little bit of maintenance. So very, very brief, but it can be pretty helpful. And then it also shows some different native plant options and the bloom season. So if you want to get started with a certification at one of these sites, you know, for the pollinator partnership, really, I have listed here, I'm not going to read it, but this is what you need to do. You need to plant the plants, you need to provide nesting sites, and you need to reduce or eliminate pesticides. There is on some of these sites like an annual registration fee, so that's something to keep in mind. But then you can, as I mentioned, you know, get a certificate and kind of get some of these signs as a way to just kind of showcase what you're doing for pollinators. The Pollinator Partnership also has different bee-friendly farming certifications. These are a little bit more in-depth, so that initial one on the last page is just like you kind of go through the checklist online. You say, yep, I'm doing these things. Whereas for the bee-friendly farming certifications, they do require a little bit more information from you, like a list of all of the plants that you know of on your farm that are good for pollinators, you know, images of those plants, images of your clean water sources and nesting habitat, and even like a farm map. So just kind of, I don't know, just a Google like snapshot would work. And then also some different pest management protocols that you have. And so this is actually a certification that you would get. And then there's also a third party step, which is probably more expensive, but also where somebody will come and actually check to see that your farm is implementing these practices, and then you get the third party verified stamp. Also for on-farm pollinator habitat, there's some really cool research from ISU about the benefits of prairie strips. And I know, like, I've talked with a few people who have pollinator strips next to their flower farms, which, you know, just kind of helps reduce some of the drift, or improve some of these, like the water infiltration and erosion and things like that. So prairie strips are an example in Iowa of what they're doing on more farm management for pollinators and ecosystem services. As I mentioned on this pollinator partnership, you can also become a pollinator steward. So there's some online classes. For this, you also do need to install some sort of habitat on your property. And then once you do that, you actually can use this stamp on emails, correspondence, resumes, or probably potentially marketing information for your farm as well. So that's kind of cool. And then pollinator.org also has downloadable signs, so you can, you know, print these off and laminate them, or you could potentially, you know, get a more permanent way to display them. But it's just a way to indicate to people what you're doing to make your garden or farm more pollinator friendly. Another organization that has a lot of information and resources about pollinator habitat is the Xerces Society. So they have full-on like resources and checklists about habitat assessment, installation, plant lists, management, all of that sort of thing. They have lists for native plant seed and plant suppliers. And then they have information about community science projects, which I think could be a fun way to incorporate the public into your farm if you're one of the farms that does some of those like U-Picks or public events. And the Xerces Society also has a Be Better Farm certification that is possible to get. I don't know that necessarily that is going to be as beneficial for flower farms. It's more for food. The food industry has this third-party verification so that you can have this pollinator conservation label on like downstream value-added packaging for different food products. The Xerces Society just has a very quick online pollinator protection pledge. And that's kind of basically what it is. Those just 4 points right there. And then they also have signs that you can purchase that indicate that you're providing pollinator habitat or that you're pesticide free or that sort of thing. Let's see. The Monarch Watch is an organization specifically that's tailored for monarch butterflies. So they also have some different requirements for like the size of the garden, the exposure, shelter, the types of different milkweed plants and nectar plants. So one thing I'll mention is monarchs can utilize lots of different types of plants for nectar, but it's the milkweed that they need to have in order to lay their eggs and have caterpillars that are going to grow. So that's one thing that I just wanted to mention there. And so you can sign up on the website and then you can get this Monarch Way Station sign as well. And this is not quite a pollinator per se, but when I was looking up some of the information for these different certifications that you could get, I found that you could also get a certified firefly habitat. So a lot of the requirements are the same, although this one does have reducing light pollution as one of their requirements as well, just because fireflies can get distracted by all of these different outside light sources. So I just thought that might be another bonus certification that is kind of interesting and important for our overall biodiversity. And then one last one, I think, is, also not specifically pollinators, but the National Wildlife Federation has the ability to get a certified wildlife habitat sign and certification. And so a lot of these requirements are still the same. There's a lot of focus on native plants. And then there's also, a checklist that goes into like the food, the water, the cover, places to raise young, and different sustainable practices. And a lot of people do this for birds. So, if you want to add on to the pollinator habitat, you can also be starting these pollinator gardens and native plants gardens for things like birds as well. So there is an application fee for this one. And then you can also qualify to be on the Homegrown National Park biodiversity map, which is kind of cool. A lot of these websites have maps that you can get on. So you can kind of type in your address or your general location and add it to the map to show like over the whole North America, like how many pollinator habitats are there. And then here's just a list. This is also from the National Wildlife Federation of keystone plants. So one of the things on this previous slide I was just going to say is you can find keystone plants for your zip code. And a keystone plant is just a plant that provides a large amount of habitat for many different insects. So for example, on the left here, we have the top 30 keystone plants for butterfly and moth caterpillars. And then on the right, we have the top 30 native host plants for pollen specialist bees. And so if you'll notice, a lot of these are trees and shrubs. And so one thing that I've talked about in some of my native plants for cut flowers talks that I've given previously is that there are a lot of really cool trees and native shrubs that provide a lot of like filler material or foliage material. So you can be using these plants as a dual purpose. You can be having them be great keystone plants for supporting all of these species, but then you can also be using them as part of your flower bouquets. And so getting into how to actually do this, Preparing the site is probably one of the most important things. I think, if anybody, who's familiar with gardening knows, you want to make sure that you've got a good site prep so that you can minimize the amount of weeds that you have. So really the method that you use depends on the site. If you just want to install a smaller pollinator garden, then you might just be able to do some sheet mulching. You can do things like solarizing or smothering the grass with like dark tarps. You can cut out the sod, although when you do disturb and kind of open up that soil to disturbance, then there is an opportunity for more weeds to grow. If you've got a really large area, doing repeated tilling over the course of a season prior to planting is another method that kind of keeps germinating new weeds or new grasses, and then you till them, and then you let those kind of grow, and then you till them again, and you do that repeatedly until you've hopefully exhausted that weed seed bed. Although I think there's probably so many weed seeds in our soil around here that that's not necessarily a guaranteed method to prevent all weeds. And then, spraying several times throughout the season prior to planting, of course, is another way that you can prepare a larger area. Depending on your area also, and the cost and what you want to put into it, you can use either seeds or transplants. For smaller pollinator gardens, I often recommend transplants just because they're going to mature a lot faster. They're a little bit more deliberate on how you can site and place those plants. If you're doing seeds, a lot of times you can just come up sporadically. Not all your seeds are going to come up the first year. But I do recommend, even if you're doing primarily transplants and kind of doing them in these different planting groups, to minimize the amount of mulch or weeds that might be present, doing a ground cover of some native grasses or even some annual flowering native plants, just to kind of fill in and outcompete those weeds in an area while your other native plants are just kind of getting established and growing, can be a good technique that you can use. For native plants, really, it depends. Most native plants require some cold stratification. So if you're doing seeds, you're going to want to do that in the fall. There are a few annual native plants that you can plant in the spring, like some grasses and things like the plains coreopsis. But oftentimes, if you're doing seeding, that would be in the fall. If you're doing transplants, you really can do that anytime, spring through fall. I'd probably maybe recommend staying away from midsummer just because that's a stressful time and they might need a little bit more water. I do a lot of my native plant transplants in the fall. So actually right now up through maybe the beginning of October is a really good time to do transplants. And then of course, water as needed in the first year. I often recommend to leave plants standing in the winter and then clean up in the spring, just because, as I mentioned, leaving some of those stems for sure for those nesting bees and different pollinators is important, but also birds use a lot of the seeds that are present on native plants. So you're kind of helping both the pollinators and the birds. And then watching for weeds and then pulling, cutting, or maybe even spot spraying as necessary is going to be helpful for kind of keeping those weeds in check while your pollinator garden is just kind of starting to take off. I also want to put a plug in, not, kind of not to make a joke, but for our grasses and sedges, a lot of people don't think about the grasses and sedges as part of their like flower gardens. But when you're thinking about native plants, pollinator gardens especially, these plants have adapted to be growing in a prairie ecosystem with a lot of grasses. And so those grasses are important to kind of help provide some root competition actually and structural support. So I do recommend putting grasses and or sedges, depending on, what your location is, into your pollinator gardens as well. And also, there are a lot of grasses and sedges that have really cool seed heads that can be used in your cut flower bouquets and things like that as well. And so I'll just go over a few examples here. For planting examples, the picture on the left here actually was taken at McCrory, and this is an example of more of that kind of grouped planting design where you have a pocket of your rudbeckia, your black-eyed Susan, a grouping of your echinacea, a grouping of your anise hyssop, and that's kind of what's more recommended for kind of providing that habitat for pollinators. I just had to throw in a picture here of the planting at the Ag Museum here in Brookings too. This is the more of the naturalistic planting style. So of course, if you want to be supporting pollinators, this is also great. When I come and visit this site, there are pollinators and bees of all different types all over these flowers as well. So depending on what your personal preference is, you know, both of these planting types of styles will work just fine. Here are a couple of pictures of a monarch caterpillar and chrysalis. So this caterpillar on the left is munching on a milkweed leaf. And then I didn't really ever realize how cool these chrysalises are. I was doing some graduate work up on campus for one of my fellow students who was tracking all of the different types of milkweeds that monarchs prefer. And so we had to look for eggs and we had to look for larvae and of course these chrysalises. And so I had no idea at like the beautiful vibrant gold that was present on them on these. And I like, it's hard to know like, where does this gold come from? But anyway, I just thought I wanted to throw that in there because it's just so cool. So if you have an opportunity to see these monarch chrysalises in person, it's just really cool. And it's also really cool to see them hatch too. Here's an example on the left of Liatris. This is a native plant. There's many different kind of varieties or species of Liatris. This one is probably Ligula stylus or the meadow blazing star. And this one is an absolute monarch favorite. So it's not a milkweed. They can't lay their eggs on it, but they absolutely love the nectar from these Liatris plants. And there are a couple places here at McCrory. There's an example right outside the building where there's a bunch of Liatris. And in the fall, like right about this time, the monarchs are just thick there. And if you walk by, you'll just have like this cloud of monarch butterflies flying around your head. And on campus, where they're growing these Liatris for seed production as well, just walking through there, it's kind of a magical experience. And so that's the kind of magical experience that you could also recreate on your farm too for your visitors. And then here on the right is a picture of an aster, and asters are also a great late season source of nectar for bees and butterflies. This picture on the left is a lead plant. It's kind of one of my, I don't have a top favorite because I like so many of them, but it is one of my favorite native plants. And so this just shows a big bumblebee with its legs covered in pollen. And you can even see that some of the area of the lead plant is already had its pollen has been picked up. And then you can see all of those little like pollen areas on the plant that the bee is still foraging around. And then this next two pictures on the right here are Coreopsis. It's a lance leaf Coreopsis. And there's just always a variety of bees and little wasps and other insects that are loving these Coreopsis flowers as well. Here's another example. On the left here is a butterfly milkweed with a spice bush swallowtail on it. And then on the right is an echinacea or a purple coneflower with another swallowtail butterfly on it. I love swallowtails. There's so many varieties of the swallowtail butterflies as well. And so as far as resources go, there's a bunch I'll go through here, but I just kind of wanted to close with this part of the presentation just to say that including these certified or maybe not even certified pollinator habitats really provides a way to showcase environmental stewardship on your farm and could be a really great marketing tool as well. So you can have certification programs, whether you have a larger farm or a smaller residential area. There's lots of different ways you can participate in providing pollinator habitat. And a lot of these flowers, grasses, shrubs, and trees also make great cut flowers and foliage plants. So they can be serving a dual purpose. Even if you're cutting a bunch of these plants, you know, there's still going to be more available if you're planting them than there would be otherwise. So. And then I also wanted to say that there are lots of really cool pollinator citizen science opportunities available, like the bumblebee counts and things like that. The Xerces Society often will advertise those types of things. So, you know, having an on-farm event where you invite the public to do some of these citizen science is just a really cool way that you can tie in environmental stewardship, science, flowers, like it's a triple or I don't know, quadruple win, I guess it could be. And then even highlighting the different pollinator events that are happening locally and around the world on your farm. So for example, Pollinator Week is usually in June, and then Moth Week is usually in July. So, highlighting some of these events, showing what you're doing for pollinators alongside all of the cut flowers that are available that are so much fun and that everybody loves, I think is just a way that we can be, having a business, but also supporting habitat and supporting these pollinators that are at risk as well. And so I mentioned some of these resources. The SDSU Native Plant Initiative is one. The Audubon Society is a good one for finding plants, and they'll also show like which plants are specifically important for different birds. The National Wildlife Foundation and a lot of these other ones I listed are where you can go to get these different certifications. If you're interested in learning more about the plants themselves, the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, the Minnesota Wildflowers, and the USDA Plant Database all are really good resources for looking up specific plants, what characteristics they have as far as height and bloom time, and then what site works best for them, like sun or the different types of soil or moisture levels that are required. And so I just kind of wanted to end with this kind of fun picture of a yard that obviously got all of the certifications. I don't know where this is. This is actually from online, but you can see that they basically have it all. And so I just wanted to highlight that if you plant it, they will come. And with that, that's what I have to present, but I'd be happy to visit, answer any questions that people might have, or to provide any other resources that might be needed.
We have one question in the chat so far, but I just want to say, as people are thinking of questions, I would also love to hear your experiences. Have you tried to plant any specific plants with pollinators in mind? Did you notice any differences? Is this something that's been interesting to you? What has stopped you? I would just really like to hear where you're all at on this topic as well. But the first question is, do most nurseries in the state carry native pollinator plants, or what is the best way to source native plants locally?
That's a good question. I will have to say that unfortunately, not all nurseries carry true native plants. A lot of nurseries will carry different cultivars. So if you go to a nursery and you see echinacea, but you see that it's an echinacea that is called like Cheyenne red, and it's a red color, then oftentimes it would be a cultivar. And depending on what characteristics have been altered, it may or may not be very suitable for pollinators. So because pollinators will take their cues from flower color, nectar guides, different shapes, if those characteristics have been altered, then they might not be very beneficial for pollinators. Also, some of those cultivars are sterile, so they don't really provide the pollen or the resources. But the best thing I would recommend people doing is asking their nurseries if they would carry more of these plants. Right now, we're kind of in the process of working with the Native Plant Initiative to get more resources out there to nurseries about how they can do that. The Native Plant Initiative does provide plants. There are the Sioux Land Prairie Farms down by Sioux Falls also provides transplants. There are some regional nurseries that you can order from, but not necessarily here in South Dakota. So I would say right now, unfortunately, finding native plants is a little bit more difficult than I would like it to be, but it's something that we are definitely working on. And by reaching out to your nurseries and suppliers and asking for more of those, that's a good way that we can kind of get more of these native plants available. But yeah, if you are a farm or you have a business, there are a lot of native plant suppliers that you can purchase, flats of different native plants wholesale. So, I mean, whether or not you're doing that for your cut flower, actual like, rows of cut flowers, or whether you're doing that to kind of integrate into a pollinator garden, that's certainly an option as well. MNL Corporation out of Minnesota has, flats of plants available, as do, quite a few other nursery suppliers. So if you want, definitely, you can send me an email and I can provide you with some of those. I don't have any one specific that I would recommend per se, but there are others available out there that you can kind of buy more plants wholesale in bulk if you are interested in that.
Christina, I don't want to call you out or pick on you, but I'm just curious if you have anything to share or even if any interesting research findings that would kind of pertain to this topic.
Hmm. I don't know about like research necessarily that I mean, wait, give me a second here. I'm gonna walk out of the lab. Everybody's working in here. Um, yeah, I mean, we definitely are striving to do all of these things. I loved listening to that, but we don't have any of the habitat signs. So maybe we need to be like that lady in the end and have all those habitat signs because we kind of do all those things and we're trying to, we don't use pesticides at all. We have all of our, we have like as little limited disturbance as we can to kind of like and provide a bunch of different habitat and all the different shapes and colors of flowers and host plants and that kind of stuff. So yeah, one thing that I have found too is just like kind of ties in is almost like sometimes I've heard them called like insectaries or something where it's like plants that attract a lot of bugs, which you kind of touched on too. And people are like, oh, I don't know if I want that. But like those predator bugs are so important. Like I'll notice them out on our farm all the time. Like I got aphids on one of my flowers, like that I was growing for a wedding. And I was like, oh no, like then what am I going to do? Because I have a limited toolbox too, compared to some, I don't use the pesticides or anything like that. And I was just like, okay, I'm just going to be patient. And I just like waited a few days and went out and there were like lacewings and lady beetles and stuff. I had eaten them all. They were gone. They were just gone. And so, encouraging some of those predator insects and just a diverse habitat helped keep it kind of in check. And then the variety, I definitely grow a variety that helps like attract a bunch of different things. And so it doesn't like decimate all of one if I do. But a lot of what you said is just kind of right on point. And we've my partner's done a lot of work on, like what a lot of those plants that you might look for in the nursery for pollinator plants are treated with, neonics or things that are gonna be very, very detrimental to the pollinators. And so, yeah, I'm glad we have like the Native Plant Initiative and some more sources and places that are encouraging the growth of native plants. And I actually just collect seed from our own prairie. Or I don't know if you like had seen that, but I started like growing, like actually germinating some of those seeds and growing them.
Cool.
And that was really fun. I collected them and just kind of had them for a while, but now I've started germinating them. And yeah, so.
Well, Christina, I should have put in, I know in the cut flower presentation that I had done before with native plants, I put in your example bouquet that I took a picture of all of your prairie plants that is just gorgeous. And so I should have put that in again, but anyway.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I loved, I mean, the prairie provides I actually wish I would have been able to attend that because I think the prairie provides so much rich diversity of cut flower opportunities that and some of them that I did start growing in my garden, like in my cut flower gardens, grow completely different than they do out on the prairie. And sometimes it works even better because they're in like all this super rich compost because I do the sheet layering that you mentioned. And so they're just like really like tall and lush and
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes that's actually an adjustment because you see a plant growing out on the prairie and you're like, oh, I really like that. And then you bring it to the garden and then it just, maybe for cut flowers or different, if you can manage it a little bit more, it's okay, but sometimes then those plants will get really big or scraggly looking or flop over, and then people are like, I
Sure.
don't like this plant because it looks more messy than I was expecting it to look. But, that's just
Yeah.
something where if you do have that rich soil, you do get a whole different kind of growth aspect. So yeah,
Yeah.
that can be either good or maybe it can be bad depending on what people's expectations are.
Well, one thing that you actually told me about out here that I experienced from some native, we have the most gorgeous bee balm out on the prairie, and it does fantastic as cut flower. It's beautiful. It's a wonderful pollinator plant. They're all over it, and we love having those up here too. But so I took seed and germinated it and planted it up in our, like, my cut flower garden area around the home, and that it gets powdery mildew there, but it's like 100% perfect and healthy on the prairie, which I
Yep.
find fascinating. Although this year it doesn't have it yet, which is interesting because it's the wettest year I've ever
I know, that is
experienced.
kind of weird.
So I don't know what that is, but yeah, that was something too, just to know, that sometimes those cultivars are kind of nice, but the natives are, yeah, I've really enjoyed. My next goal is to put a bunch of the liatrices out in
Oh,
the,
yeah. Those are just a
Uh,
treat. Like, I love
yes.
the look of them. I love how they're so structural and upright. But then, yeah, the pollinators just love them, and especially the monarchs too. And I
Hmm.
do want to put in a little plug to say, many cultivars probably don't have as many benefits for pollinators, but there is research, especially by like the Mount Cuba Institute, to actually look
Mm.
into which cultivars are best,
Mm.
for pollinators, just so people have a little bit more options and maybe a little bit more availability for some of these native plants. So I don't know if I put that in the resources, but the Mount Cuba Center
Mount Cuba.
is doing some research onto cultivars, and they're growing out all kinds of different cultivars of like ironweed or bee balm or,
Okay.
different things like that, just to see, what is still beneficial that we might be able to have a little bit more control over, whether or not you
Hmm.
think that's a good thing or not. But,
Right. Yeah.
just maybe a little bit more available to the nursery industry.
No, that's good to know. I've always been very curious about that. So I'll be curious to see how that turns out because, like, McCrory Gardens grows, I don't know what huge percent of, cultivated varieties, and you'd see so many
Mhm.
pollinators out there that I was
Yeah.
always very curious, like which ones are they actually getting used from and which ones are they not? And
Mhm.
so that'll be, yeah, neat to see. But yeah, I don't know if that it's just kind of my experience with it too. I love this talk. It was a good one. So